You've been knocked down so many times that getting back up feels pointless, and every setback makes you question whether you have what it takes to keep fighting. The defeats are piling up faster than the victories, and you're starting to wonder if resilience is just something other people are born with while you're destined to surrender. I am Sun Tzu, the ancient strategist who understood that defeat is never final, it's simply information. And I've spent over 2,500 years teaching leaders how to transform their darkest moments into their greatest advantages. What I discovered about turning defeat into victory will completely change how you view every setback, giving you the strategic mindset to emerge stronger from any battle life throws at you. The same principles that helped ancient warriors rise from crushing defeats can help you transform your current struggles into stepping stones to ultimate triumph. But first, like this video, subscribe for more battle-tested wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world needs to learn the art of turning defeat into victory. The same principles that helped ancient warriors rise from crushing defeats can help you transform your current struggles into stepping stones to ultimate triumph. But first, like this video, subscribe for more battle-tested wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world needs to learn the art of turning defeat into victory. Let me take you back to a moment that nearly ended my career as a strategist before it truly began. I was a young officer in the armies of the Wu Kingdom, filled with theoretical knowledge, but lacking the harsh wisdom that only comes from being thoroughly defeated. My banner, the symbol of my authority and strategy, trampled in the mud, soaked with rain and stained with the reality of my miscalculations. I had planned what I believed to be a brilliant flanking maneuver against an enemy force. On paper, every element seemed perfect. I had studied the terrain, calculated troop movements, and anticipated enemy responses. But when the battle commenced, nothing unfolded as I had envisioned. The enemy commander had anticipated my strategy and turned my own plan against me. My troops were routed, scattered like leaves in a storm, and I found myself standing alone on a hill, watching my forces retreat in disarray. The humiliation was crushing. Fellow officers whispered behind my back, questioning whether I possessed the judgment necessary for command. Some suggested I return to scholarly pursuits, leaving warfare to those with natural instincts for battle. The doubt crept into my own mind like poison. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps I was destined to be a theorist rather than a practitioner, someone who understood war from books but could never master it in reality. For weeks, I wandered through camp like a ghost of my former confidence. Every time I attempted to contribute to strategic discussions, I remembered that muddy banner and the sound of my retreating soldiers. The weight of failure pressed down on me with such force that I considered abandoning military service entirely. I drafted letters to my family, preparing to return home in disgrace. But then something remarkable happened. As I sat by my tent one evening, studying the tactical maps of my failed battle, I began to see patterns I had missed before. The enemy's successful counter-strategy revealed weaknesses in their own positioning that I could have exploited if I had recognized them. My defeat wasn't just a failure, was a comprehensive education in the realities of warfare that no classroom could have provided. That night, I realized that my muddy banner hadn't marked the end of my strategic career. It had marked the beginning of my real education. Every mistake I had made was now burned into my memory with perfect clarity. I understood not just what I had done wrong, but why it had gone wrong, and most importantly, how the enemy's mind had worked to defeat me. I began to see defeat not as a judgment of my worth, but as intelligence gathered at great cost. The humiliation I felt wasn't the universe telling me I was inadequate, it was the price I paid for invaluable knowledge about both warfare and myself. That defeat taught me more about strategy in a single day than years of studying ancient texts had accomplished. From that moment forward, I approached every setback with a different mindset. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" I began asking, "What is this teaching me?" The shift was revolutionary. My defeats became my most valuable teachers, and my failures became the foundation for strategies that would later be studied for millennia. My philosophical breakthrough about defeat's true nature came not in a moment of triumph, but during my deepest contemplation of failure. I began to understand that defeat is never what it appears to be on the surface. Most people see defeat as evidence of their inadequacy, but I discovered it's actually the universe's way of providing course corrections for those wise enough to listen. Think of defeat like a broken arrow that missed its intended target. The archer's first instinct is to curse the arrow, blame the wind, or question their skill. But the wise archer studies where the arrow landed, examines the conditions that caused the miss, and adjusts their aim accordingly. The broken arrow becomes more valuable than a dozen that hit their mark, because it teaches what success never could. I learned that defeat serves as feedback from reality about the gap between our strategies and the world as it actually exists. When our plans fail, it's not because the world is unfair or we're destined for failure. It's because our understanding was incomplete. Defeat is reality's harsh but honest teacher, showing us exactly where our thinking was flawed. Most people interpret defeat incorrectly because they make it about their identity rather than their strategy. They think defeat means they are failures, when it actually means their current approach is insufficient. This misinterpretation turns temporary setbacks into permanent identities, transforming learning opportunities into sources of shame and paralysis. I discovered there's a crucial distinction between losing a battle and losing the war. A battle is a single engagement with specific conditions, tactics, and circumstances. A war is the larger campaign with multiple battles, evolving strategies, and long-term objectives. You can lose numerous battles and still win the war, but only if you understand that each battle defeat is intelligence gathering for the ultimate victory. When I was defeated in that first major battle, I thought the war was over. I failed to understand that this was merely the opening engagement in a much larger campaign. The enemy had won a battle by exposing weaknesses in my strategy, but they had also revealed their own methods and capabilities. Every move they made to defeat me was simultaneously information I could use to defeat them in future encounters. Defeat also reveals hidden weaknesses that success keeps buried. When everything goes according to plan, we never discover the flaws in our thinking or the vulnerabilities in our approach. Success can make us overconfident and blind to our limitations. Defeat strips away our illusions and forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our preparation, judgment, and execution. I began to see defeat as a diagnostic tool that reveals exactly where we need to improve. Just as a doctor uses symptoms to identify illness, a strategist uses defeat to identify weaknesses. The pain of defeat is like the pain of injury, unpleasant but essential information about what needs healing. This understanding transformed my relationship with failure completely. Instead of avoiding defeat, I began to extract maximum value from it. I studied my losses with the same intensity that others celebrated their victories. Each defeat became a detailed case study in what doesn't work, which is often more valuable than knowing what does work in limited circumstances. I learned to read defeat like a military intelligence report, extracting valuable information from every setback with the precision of a scholar analyzing ancient texts. Just as capturing an enemy's battle plans reveals their thinking, studying your defeats reveals the hidden forces working against your success. When I began treating defeats as intelligence reports, everything changed. I would sit with my advisors after each setback and conduct what I called defeat autopsies, detailed examinations of exactly what went wrong, when it went wrong, and why it went wrong. We mapped out every decision point, every assumption we had made, and every factor we had failed to consider. What your defeats are telling you about your approach is more valuable than what your successes are telling you about your strengths. Success can happen for many reasons, including luck, favorable conditions, or weak opposition. But defeat is brutally honest. It strips away everything except the core truth about your strategy's effectiveness. I discovered there are 3 distinct types of defeats that require different responses. Strategic defeats occur when your overall approach is fundamentally flawed. These are the most painful, but also the most valuable, because they force you to rebuild your entire framework of thinking. Tactical defeats happen when your strategy is sound, but your execution is poor. These teach you about implementation and timing. Personal defeats arise from internal factors like fear, overconfidence, or emotional reactions that sabotage otherwise solid plans. Understanding which type of defeat you've experienced determines how you should respond. Strategic defeats require you to go back to the foundation and rebuild. Tactical defeats need refinement and practice. Personal defeats demand inner work and character development. Misdiagnosing the type of defeat leads to applying the wrong solution, which often creates additional defeats. I noticed that intelligent people often struggle most with defeat because they're accustomed to understanding things quickly and executing successfully. When defeat comes, their intelligence becomes a liability. They overanalyze themselves and become paralyzed by the complexity of what went wrong. They assume that because they're smart, they should be able to figure out how to avoid all defeats. But intelligence without wisdom is like a sharp sword without proper training, more likely to wound the wielder than the enemy. Intelligent people must learn that defeat is not a contradiction of their intelligence, but an education for it. The smartest generals I knew were those who had been defeated thoroughly and learned to view their intelligence as a tool for extracting lessons rather than a shield against failure. The key to extracting maximum learning from minimum pain is developing systematic approaches to defeat analysis. I created specific questions that I would ask after every setback. What assumptions did I make that proved false? What information did I lack that I should have gathered? What did the opposition do that I failed to anticipate? How did my emotions influence my decisions? What would I do differently if faced with identical circumstances? These questions transformed defeat from a source of shame into a source of education. Each answered question became a piece of intelligence that improved my future strategies. I began to accumulate a comprehensive understanding of what doesn't work, which proved just as valuable as knowing what does work. The most important battlefield is not the external one where your defeats occur, but the internal one where you interpret what those defeats mean. I discovered that victory or defeat in this mental battlefield determines whether external setbacks destroy you or transform you into an unstoppable force. When I suffered my first major defeat, I was fighting 2 wars simultaneously. The external war against my enemy was already lost, but the internal war for my mind's interpretation of that loss would determine my entire future. In that inner battlefield, I had to choose between 2 competing narratives. Either I was fundamentally inadequate as a strategist, or I had received expensive but invaluable education. The stories we tell ourselves about what defeat means become the reality we live within. If you tell yourself that defeat proves you're not cut out for success, that story becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Every future challenge becomes evidence supporting your narrative of inadequacy. But if you tell yourself that defeat is data collection for your eventual triumph, every setback becomes fuel for your growth. I learned to rewrite the narrative from victim to strategist by changing the questions I asked about my defeats. Instead of "why does this always happen to me?" I began asking, "what is this teaching me about my next move?" Instead of "what's wrong with me?" I asked, "what's wrong with my current approach?" Instead of "will I ever succeed?" I asked how will this failure contribute to my eventual success. This shift in questioning completely transformed my relationship with setbacks. The same defeats that once felt like personal attacks from the universe became strategic intelligence that I could use to my advantage. The pain remained the same, but the meaning changed entirely. And meaning determines whether pain destroys you or strengthens you. Building mental fortresses that setbacks cannot breach requires understanding that your thoughts about defeat are more powerful than the defeat itself. The external defeat is a temporary event, but your internal interpretation of that defeat can become a permanent identity. Protecting your mind from destructive interpretations is like building walls around a city, essential for survival during siege warfare. I developed what I called the strategist's mindset, a way of thinking that automatically translated every setback into strategic advantage. When my plans failed, instead of feeling defeated, I felt educated. When opponents outmaneuvered me, instead of feeling humiliated, I felt like I had gained insight into superior tactics. When my troops retreated, instead of feeling ashamed, I felt like I had learned valuable lessons about leadership under pressure. This mental reframing didn't make defeats painless, but it made them purposeful. The pain of defeat became the price of education rather than evidence of inadequacy. Just as physical pain signals that your body needs attention, the pain of defeat signals that your strategy needs adjustment. Both types of pain serve essential functions when interpreted correctly. The reflecting pool of self-awareness shows us the truth about our defeats without the distortion of emotion or ego. When we look into this pool with honesty, we see that our defeats are not random punishments, but logical consequences of specific decisions and actions. This clear vision allows us to make precise adjustments rather than wholesale changes based on emotional reactions to failure. One of the most difficult lessons I learned was that retreat is not defeat, but repositioning. In the heat of battle, when your forces are overwhelmed and your position is compromised, the instinct is to fight harder, to throw everything you have into one final desperate assault. But wisdom taught me that sometimes the most courageous action is to withdraw strategically, preserving your strength for a battle you can actually win. I discovered this principle during a campaign where my forces were vastly outnumbered. Every conventional approach to victory had failed, and continuing to engage would have meant complete annihilation. My pride demanded that I fight to the last man, but my strategic mind recognized that preserving my army for future engagement was the path to ultimate victory. The retreat felt like cowardice, but it was actually the highest form of strategic thinking. The difference between giving up and strategic withdrawal lies in purpose and planning. Giving up is surrendering without learning, abandoning your objectives permanently, and accepting defeat as final. Strategic withdrawal is temporary repositioning that serves a larger plan, preserves your resources for more favorable conditions, and maintains your ultimate objectives while changing your immediate tactics. When you retreat with dignity and preserve your resources, you maintain the ability to choose when and where your next engagement will occur. Instead of fighting on your opponent's terms at their chosen time and place, you create space to analyze their strengths and weaknesses, while building your own capabilities for a future confrontation under more favorable circumstances. I learned that the best generals choose their battles carefully because they understand that not every confrontation needs to be won immediately. Some battles are meant to be fought later, when conditions are more favorable and preparation is more complete. The amateur fights every battle as if it's the final one, while the professional views each battle as part of a larger campaign. Using retreat to study your opponent's weaknesses is one of the most overlooked advantages of strategic withdrawal. When you're engaged in direct confrontation, you're focused on immediate survival and response. But when you step back, you can observe patterns in your opponent's behavior, identify their preferred strategies, and discover vulnerabilities that aren't visible in the heat of battle. During my strategic retreats, I made my greatest discoveries about enemy tactics. I could see how they pursued, how they regrouped, where they became overconfident, and when they made mistakes. This intelligence became invaluable for planning future engagements where I could exploit these observed weaknesses. The phoenix feather represents this principle perfectly, the mythical bird that withdraws from battle through death, only to rise again with greater power and wisdom. Strategic retreat is your phoenix moment, where apparent defeat becomes the foundation for spectacular comeback. You're not running away from the fight. You're choosing to fight it at a time and place where victory is possible. I've seen too many promising careers destroyed by the inability to retreat strategically. Leaders who could have regrouped and returned stronger instead chose to fight losing battles until they had nothing left to fight with. Their pride became their enemy's greatest weapon, ensuring that temporary setbacks became permanent defeats. Strategic retreat requires swallowing your pride in service of your larger objectives. It means accepting short-term appearances of weakness in order to build long-term strength. It means disappointing people who expect you to fight every battle immediately, while positioning yourself to win the war that truly matters. My greatest discovery was that every weakness contains a hidden strength waiting to be revealed through proper understanding and application. Like a sword that breaks in battle only to be reforged into a superior weapon, your defeats expose vulnerabilities that can be transformed into your most powerful advantages. During one particularly humbling defeat, I realized that what I considered my greatest weakness, my tendency to overthink every situation, was actually my greatest strength when properly channeled. While other commanders relied on instinct and emotion, my careful analysis allowed me to see patterns and possibilities they missed entirely. The key was learning to use this trait strategically rather than allowing it to create paralysis. How defeats expose our vulnerabilities for transformation is one of the most profound gifts failure offers. Success often masks our weaknesses, allowing us to continue using flawed approaches that work temporarily but fail under pressure. Defeat strips away these comfortable illusions and forces us to confront the gaps in our capabilities that we've been unconsciously avoiding. I learned the ancient art of using an opponent's force against them by studying how my own defeats occurred. In many cases, my enemies succeeded not through superior strength, but by redirecting my own energy in ways that worked against me. Once I understood this principle, I began applying it to my own weaknesses, finding ways to make my limitations serve my objectives. For example, my natural caution, which had sometimes prevented decisive action, became a strategic advantage when I learned to use it for thorough preparation, while others rushed into premature engagement. My inability to inspire through charismatic speeches became an advantage when I focused on inspiring through consistent competence and careful strategy rather than emotional appeals. Converting personal limitations into strategic advantages requires honest assessment of your actual capabilities combined with creative thinking about how those capabilities can serve your objectives. Instead of trying to eliminate your weaknesses, you learn to position yourself where those weaknesses become irrelevant or even beneficial. I discovered that your greatest defeats often precede your greatest victories, because defeat forces the kind of fundamental learning and adaptation that success never demands. When everything goes according to plan, you never discover what you're truly capable of achieving under pressure. But when plans fail completely, you're forced to access reserves of creativity, resilience, and determination that you didn't know existed. The bent sword principle taught me that apparent damage often creates opportunity for improvement that wouldn't have existed otherwise. A sword that breaks reveals weaknesses in the metal that can be corrected in the reforging process. Similarly, defeats reveal weaknesses in your approach that can be corrected in your rebuilding process. often resulting in capabilities far superior to your original state. During my most difficult period, when defeat followed defeat in seemingly endless succession, I began to see each setback as raw material for building something unprecedented. Instead of viewing my failures as evidence of inadequacy, I began collecting them like a craftsman collecting materials for a masterwork. Each defeat taught me something that success never could have revealed. This transformation in perspective allowed me to approach challenges with a completely different mindset. Instead of fearing failure, I began to see it as education that I was paying for with temporary discomfort. Instead of avoiding situations where I might fail, I began seeking opportunities to fail intelligently, knowing that each failure brought me closer to the breakthrough understanding I was pursuing. I learned that timing is everything in recovery from defeat, and patience is the strategist's most powerful weapon. Like an eagle that circles high above its prey, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike, the wise person recovers from defeat not through immediate action but through patient preparation for precisely the right opportunity. After my most devastating early defeats, my first instinct was to rush back into battle immediately, driven by the burning need to prove that my failure was an aberration rather than a revelation of my true capabilities. This urgency felt like courage, but it was actually fear disguised as action fear. The delay would somehow confirm my inadequacy. The difference between immediate reaction and strategic response became clear during a campaign where I had been thoroughly outmaneuvered. My emotional mind demanded instant retaliation, but my strategic mind recognized that immediate action would only compound my defeats. Instead of reacting from a position of weakness and emotional turmoil, I chose to respond from a position of strength and clarity that only time and reflection could provide. Learning to wait for the right moment to strike back requires mastering the most difficult form of self-discipline, the discipline of inaction when action feels urgent. Every fiber of your being wants to prove that the defeat was temporary, to show the world and yourself that you haven't been broken. But premature action from this emotional state almost always leads to additional defeats that could have been avoided. I developed what I called strategic patience, the ability to endure the discomfort of appearing inactive while actually engaging in the most important work of preparation and timing. During these periods of apparent inactivity, I was studying my opponents, refining my strategies, building my capabilities, and most importantly, waiting for conditions to shift in my favor. Building patience as a weapon against impulsive defeat requires understanding that urgency is often the enemy's greatest ally. When you act from urgency, you're acting from their timeline rather than your own. You're allowing their pressure to dictate your responses, which means you're fighting on their terms rather than creating your own advantageous conditions. The waiting eagle teaches us that predators don't hunt frantically, they hunt systematically. They observe their prey's patterns, identify moments of vulnerability, and strike with precision when success is most likely. Humans can learn this same approach to recovering from defeat, using time as an ally rather than treating it as an enemy. I discovered that rushed recoveries often lead to deeper defeats because they're based on emotion rather than strategy. When you're desperate to recover quickly, you're willing to accept unfavorable odds, insufficient preparation, and suboptimal conditions. This desperation becomes visible to your opponents, who can exploit your impatience to create additional defeats. True strategic patience isn't passive waiting, it's active preparation combined with disciplined timing. During patient periods, you're building strength, gathering intelligence, developing new capabilities, and positioning yourself for maximum advantage when the right opportunity presents itself. The eagle circles, not because it's inactive, but because it's calculating the perfect moment for action. Patient strategists understand that delayed victory is often more complete and lasting than rushed success. When you wait for optimal conditions, Your eventual triumph is built on solid foundations rather than lucky circumstances. Defeat taught me one of the most humbling but essential truths about recovery. You cannot overcome major setbacks alone. The same pride that contributes to our defeats often prevents us from seeking the alliances and support necessary for our comeback. I learned that building strategic relationships after defeat is not a sign of weakness, but the hallmark of true strategic thinking. My most isolated period came after a series of defeats that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about warfare. Pride convinced me that I needed to solve these problems alone, that seeking help would confirm my inadequacy to those who already doubted my capabilities. This isolation nearly destroyed me, not because I lacked the knowledge to recover, but because I lacked the perspective that only others could provide. Why you cannot recover from major defeats alone became clear when I realized that defeat distorts your perception in ways you cannot detect from the inside. When you're in the midst of failure, your judgment is compromised by emotion, your confidence is shaken by doubt, and your perspective is limited by the very thinking that contributed to the defeat. You need outside viewpoints to see clearly. Building alliances with others who understand your struggle creates a foundation of shared wisdom that no individual can achieve alone. These aren't casual relationships, but strategic partnerships with people who have walked similar paths and can offer insights drawn from their own battles with defeat and recovery. They serve as mirrors that reflect truths you cannot see yourself. I discovered that the power of shared experience in overcoming setbacks extends far beyond emotional support. When you connect with others who have faced similar defeats, you gain access to strategies they developed, mistakes they learned to avoid, and perspectives they gained through their own hard-fought victories. Their defeats become additional data points in your recovery strategy. Creating support systems before you need them is one of the most important lessons I learned about alliance building. The time to build relationships is not when you're desperate for help, but when you're in a position to offer value to others. Strong alliances are built on mutual benefit, not one-sided need. During my successful periods, I made it a practice to connect with other military leaders, not for immediate gain, but for long-term strategic relationship building. I shared knowledge, offered assistance, and invested in the success of others. When my own defeats came, these relationships provided the foundation for recovery that would have been impossible to build during crisis. The healing circle represents the ancient wisdom that warriors need a place to share their wounds and learn from each other's experiences. In these circles, defeat loses its shame and becomes valuable currency for building stronger strategies. Each person's failure contributes to the collective wisdom that protects everyone. I learned to be vulnerable about my defeats with trusted allies, not because vulnerability is inherently valuable, but because it creates the foundation for receiving genuinely useful feedback. When you pretend your defeats don't affect you, others cannot offer the specific help you actually need. Authentic sharing of your struggles invites authentic assistance. Strategic alliances also provide accountability that prevents the isolation and distorted thinking that often accompany prolonged defeat. Your allies can recognize when you're falling into destructive patterns, challenge your assumptions when they become counterproductive, and remind you of your capabilities when defeat has clouded your self-perception. What I learned about preparing for comeback while appearing defeated became one of my most powerful strategic advantages. Like a blacksmith working in a hidden forge, crafting superior weapons while enemies believe you're defenseless, the art of invisible preparation allows you to build overwhelming strength while others assume you're still broken from your defeats. The power of invisible improvement and skill building lies in the element of surprise it creates for your eventual return. When opponents believe they have defeated you completely, they stop monitoring your activities and preparing for your comeback. This complacency becomes your greatest opportunity to develop capabilities that will shock them when you choose to reveal them. During my longest period of apparent defeat, I established what I called my hidden forge, a systematic approach to skill development that occurred completely away from public scrutiny. While others saw me as a defeated strategist licking his wounds, I was actually engaging in the most intensive learning and preparation of my entire career. How to use defeat as cover for strategic development requires understanding that public perception of your current state can work in your favor. When people believe you're down and out, they're not expecting innovation, growth, or preparation. They assume you're focused on basic survival rather than building new capabilities. This assumption creates perfect camouflage for extraordinary development work. I spent months studying the strategies of every great military leader in history, not just reading about their victories, but analyzing their defeats and recoveries. I practiced new tactical approaches in private exercises, developed innovative strategies through theoretical wargames, and built physical and mental conditioning that far exceeded my previous standards. All of this occurred while maintaining the appearance of someone still struggling with recent defeats. Building strength in areas your enemies cannot see creates multiple advantages. First, they cannot prepare countermeasures for capabilities they don't know exist. Second, they cannot steal or copy innovations they cannot observe. Third, they cannot undermine your development through interference or sabotage. Your hidden growth becomes a strategic surprise that multiplies the impact of your eventual comeback. The element of surprise in your eventual return cannot be overestimated. When you reveal capabilities that no one expected you to possess, the psychological impact on opponents can be as powerful as the tactical advantage. They must rapidly reassess their understanding of your abilities while simultaneously responding to your new strategic reality. I remember the first engagement after my hidden forge period, when I employed tactics and strategies that completely confounded my opponents. They had prepared for the old Sun Tzu, the one they had defeated before. They were utterly unprepared for the evolved strategist who had used defeat as a catalyst for revolutionary growth. Their shock and confusion became additional weapons in my arsenal. During invisible preparation periods, the most important work often happens in areas that don't seem directly related to your main objectives. I studied philosophy to improve my strategic thinking, practiced meditation to enhance my decision-making under pressure, and even learned about agriculture to better understand supply chain logistics. These seemingly unrelated skills became integrated advantages that opponents could never have anticipated. The hidden forge principle applies to any kind of defeat or setback. While others see your current struggles, you can be developing skills, building knowledge, creating innovations, and preparing capabilities that will transform your future engagements. Your apparent weakness becomes the perfect cover for building unprecedented strength. How defeats reveal opportunities that success obscures became one of my most valuable discoveries. When you're winning consistently, you tend to see only the obvious paths, the well-traveled routes that have brought success before. But when defeat forces you to abandon conventional approaches, you begin to notice hidden passages and alternative routes that were invisible during your periods of triumph. During one of my most challenging campaigns, traditional strategies had failed repeatedly, leaving me with what appeared to be an impossible situation. The obvious paths to victory were blocked, my resources were depleted, and conventional wisdom suggested retreat was the only option. But as I studied the terrain of my circumstances with the desperate clarity that only comes from having no easy options, I began to see possibilities that success had blinded me to. Learning to see advantage in disadvantage requires shifting your perspective from lamenting what you lack to investigating what your unique position makes possible. When you're operating from a position of apparent weakness, you're forced to become creative, resourceful, and innovative in ways that comfort never demands. This forced creativity often leads to breakthrough solutions that would never emerge from conventional thinking. The art of finding hidden paths when main routes are blocked is like discovering secret passages in a mountain range. The established trails are crowded with travelers following predictable routes, but the hidden paths are accessible only to those willing to explore uncharted territory. Your defeats force you off the main trails and into the exploration that reveals these hidden passages. I discovered that some of the greatest opportunities come disguised as defeats because they force you into situations where conventional competition doesn't exist. When my traditional approaches failed, I was pushed into developing entirely new methods that others couldn't anticipate or counter. What appeared to be disadvantageous positioning actually became the foundation for unprecedented strategic advantages. During one particularly difficult period, I found myself commanding a smaller force against a much larger army, operating with limited supplies in unfamiliar territory. Every conventional metric suggested certain defeat, but these limitations forced me to develop tactics based on speed, intelligence, and psychological warfare rather than brute force. The strategies I developed during this disadvantaged period became legendary and were studied by military leaders for centuries. Positioning yourself for unexpected breakthroughs requires understanding that linear thinking rarely produces revolutionary results. When you're forced to abandon linear approaches due to defeat, you're pushed into the kind of non-linear thinking that creates genuine innovations. The constraints imposed by defeat become catalysts for creativity that abundance never provides. The topographical scroll represents the comprehensive understanding of your strategic landscape that only comes from careful study during difficult times. When success comes easily, you never need to map the terrain thoroughly. But when every obvious route is blocked, you're forced to develop detailed understanding of alternative possibilities that others have never explored. I learned to treat defeats as surveying expeditions into unexplored strategic territory. Each setback revealed new information about what was possible under difficult conditions, what resources could be accessed through unconventional means, and what approaches might work when traditional methods failed. This intelligence became invaluable for future situations where creative solutions were required. My philosophy of using defeat's energy for comeback momentum transformed how I understood the relationship between setbacks and eventual triumph. Like a coiled spring that stores energy when compressed only to release it with multiplied force, every defeat contains potential energy that can be harnessed for a more powerful return than would have been possible without the initial compression. Learning to channel frustration and anger into strategic fuel became one of my most valuable skills. The emotional energy generated by defeat is tremendous, raw, intense, and often destructive if not properly directed. But when this energy is channeled through strategic thinking rather than emotional reaction, it becomes rocket fuel for extraordinary comeback efforts. I discovered this principle during a campaign where I had been publicly humiliated by an opponent who used my own tactics against me. The rage and frustration I felt could have destroyed my judgment and led to reckless actions that would have compounded my defeat. Instead, I learned to treat these powerful emotions as raw materials for focused determination and systematic preparation. The difference between revenge and strategic victory lies in purpose and methodology. Revenge is emotional satisfaction that often creates additional problems and leaves you vulnerable to further defeats. Strategic victory is the systematic dismantling of whatever caused your defeat, ensuring that similar setbacks cannot occur again while achieving your original objectives through superior methods. Revenge thinking focuses on making your opponent suffer as you suffered. Strategic thinking focuses on making yourself so capable that your previous level of defeat becomes impossible. Revenge is about the past, punishing what happened. Strategy is about the future, ensuring what you want to happen will happen. Building launch platforms from the rubble of defeat requires seeing your setbacks not as evidence of permanent inadequacy, but as raw materials for constructing something unprecedented. Every defeat teaches you something about what doesn't work, which is valuable intelligence for building what does work. The rubble of failure becomes the foundation stones of future success. During my most systematic comeback, I literally made lists of everything that had contributed to my defeats, every miscalculation, every oversight, every weakness that had been exploited. But instead of using this list for self-flagellation, I used it as a blueprint for building capabilities that would make those particular defeats impossible to repeat. Why the best comebacks are methodical, not emotional, became clear as I studied successful recoveries throughout history. Emotional comebacks are dramatic but often unsustainable because they're built on temporary motivation rather than permanent capability changes. Methodical comebacks are built on systematic improvements that create lasting advantages. The coiled spring teaches us that compression is not punishment but preparation. When a spring is compressed, it's not being damaged, being loaded with potential energy that will be released with greater force than the original compression. Similarly, when you're compressed by defeat, you're being loaded with motivation, knowledge, and determination that can propel you to heights that would have been impossible without the initial setback. I learned to view every defeat as a loading phase in my personal spring mechanism. The more pressure applied, the more energy stored for eventual release. This perspective transformed the experience of being defeated from humiliation into preparation, from ending into beginning. How defeat taught me that rigid strategies break under pressure became one of my most profound lessons about the nature of resilience. I had approached my early campaigns with carefully crafted plans that I believed were comprehensive enough to handle any situation. When these rigid strategies encountered unexpected resistance, they shattered like brittle metal under stress, teaching me that flexibility is not weakness, but the highest form of strategic strength. The importance of flexibility in your recovery approach cannot be overstated. When you're recovering from defeat, the temptation is to create another rigid plan that you hope will guarantee success this time. But recovery rarely follows straight lines or predictable timelines. The same adaptability that water shows when flowing around rocks must characterize your approach to overcoming setbacks. I learned to flow around obstacles instead of fighting them directly by observing how water always finds a way to reach its destination regardless of what barriers appear in its path. Water doesn't declare war on rocks, it simply flows around them, under them, or over them, maintaining its essential nature while adapting its form to current circumstances. This became my model for strategic adaptability. During one particularly challenging recovery period, I had developed what I thought was the perfect comeback strategy. Every detail was planned, every contingency anticipated. But when I began implementation, the circumstances had changed in ways I couldn't have predicted. My rigid plan became an obstacle to my own success because I was more committed to following the plan than to achieving the objective. Maintaining core principles while adapting tactics requires understanding the difference between your essential nature and your temporary methods. Your principles, your fundamental values, and ultimate objectives should remain constant like water's essential nature. But your tactics, the specific methods you use to achieve those objectives, should be as flexible as water's ability to take any shape necessary. I developed what I called principled adaptability, the ability to maintain unwavering commitment to core objectives while remaining completely flexible about the methods used to achieve them. This approach allowed me to stay true to my essential strategic nature while adapting to any circumstance that required tactical modifications. Why the most successful people are the most adaptable became clear as I studied patterns of long-term achievement. Those who succeeded consistently over time were not those with the best initial strategies, but those who could modify their approaches most effectively as circumstances changed. they treated their methods as tools to be changed when necessary, not as identities to be defended regardless of effectiveness. The flowing river teaches us that persistence and adaptability are not opposites, but complementary forces. The river is absolutely persistent in reaching its destination. It never gives up or accepts permanent blockage. But it's also completely adaptable in its methods, willing to take any path, any form, any route that serves its ultimate objective of reaching the sea. I learned to ask different questions when facing obstacles during recovery. Instead of how can I force my plan to work despite this obstacle, I began asking how can I maintain my objective while adapting my approach to current conditions. This shift in questioning opened possibilities that rigid thinking had closed off. Successful adaptation requires letting go of attachment to specific methods while maintaining fierce commitment to ultimate outcomes. Your ego may be invested in proving that your original approach was correct, but your success depends on using whatever approach actually works in current reality. How I learned to build momentum from tiny wins after major defeats became the foundation for my most spectacular comebacks. Like a single seed that appears insignificant but contains the potential for a mighty tree, small victories after defeat carry the genetic code for complete recovery when nurtured with consistency and patience. The psychology of progress and forward movement is more powerful than the magnitude of individual achievements. When you're recovering from defeat, your confidence is damaged and your belief in your abilities is shaken. Small victories serve as proof that progress is possible, rebuilding your psychological foundation one small success at a time. After my most devastating defeats, I discovered that attempting to achieve immediate major victories often led to additional failures that further damaged my confidence. Instead, I learned to identify the smallest possible wins that I could achieve with near certainty, then build a systematic approach to accumulating these minor victories until they created unstoppable momentum. Why small victories compound into large triumphs lies in their cumulative psychological and practical effects. Each small win rebuilds a piece of your confidence, teaches you something about what works, and creates evidence that contradicts the story of permanent failure that defeat tries to establish in your mind. These effects multiply rather than simply add together. I developed what I called the victory ladder, a systematic progression of increasingly challenging but achievable objectives that would rebuild my capabilities and confidence simultaneously. Each rung on the ladder was designed to be clearly winnable while preparing me for the next level of challenge. The key was making each step small enough to guarantee success while meaningful enough to build real momentum. Building unstoppable momentum from seemingly insignificant actions requires understanding that momentum is not about the size of individual actions, but about the consistency and direction of accumulated effort. A single drop of water is insignificant, but consistent drops can carve through solid rock. Similarly, consistent small victories can overcome obstacles that appear insurmountable. During one recovery period, I started with victories so small they seemed almost embarrassing, things like maintaining a daily routine, completing simple training exercises, or having brief productive conversations with subordinates. But each small success rebuilt a piece of my shattered confidence and reminded me that I was capable of achieving what I set out to do. The patience required to let small wins accumulate tests your character in ways that both success and failure never could. Success happens quickly enough to satisfy your ego, and failure happens dramatically enough to capture your attention. But small wins require you to find satisfaction in progress that others might not even notice, building internal motivation that doesn't depend on external recognition. I learned that compound momentum works like compound interest. The effects are barely noticeable at first, but become exponentially powerful over time. The first small victories feel insignificant, but each subsequent victory builds on all the previous ones, creating acceleration that eventually becomes irresistible force. The growing seed teaches us that massive results don't require massive beginnings, they require consistent nurturing of small beginnings. A mighty oak doesn't announce its potential when it's still an acorn, but with proper conditions and patient cultivation, it becomes something that can weather any storm. Successful recovery requires celebrating small victories with the same intensity that you would celebrate major triumphs, because in the context of comeback, small victories are major triumphs. They represent proof that the defeat was temporary and that your capability for success remains intact. The internal battle that determines external outcomes became the most crucial front in my war against defeat. I discovered that while external circumstances create the conditions for setbacks, internal responses determine whether those setbacks become temporary obstacles or permanent limitations. Mastering the inner game of defeat is the difference between resilience and resignation. How I developed unshakable inner confidence despite setbacks required completely redefining what confidence actually means. I had previously thought confidence meant certainty about outcomes, believing that I would definitely succeed in every endeavor. But true confidence, I learned, is certainty about your ability to handle whatever outcomes occur, including defeat and failure. This shift from outcome-based confidence to process-based confidence transformed my relationship with uncertainty and risk. Instead of needing guarantees about success to feel confident, I built confidence in my ability to learn from failure, adapt to changing circumstances, and persist through temporary setbacks. This inner certainty became unshakable because it didn't depend on external validation. Techniques for maintaining composure under pressure became essential tools in my strategic arsenal. I developed systematic methods for managing the mental and emotional chaos that accompanies defeat. These included controlled breathing exercises that prevented panic from clouding my judgment, mental rehearsal practices that prepared me for various scenarios, and philosophical frameworks that maintained perspective during crisis. One of my most powerful techniques was what I called the observer's stance, the ability to step back mentally and observe my own emotional reactions to defeat without being controlled by them. Instead of being overwhelmed by frustration, anger, or despair, I learned to watch these emotions arise and pass without allowing them to dictate my decisions. Building identity that transcends temporary defeats required understanding the difference between what you do and who you are. When your identity is too closely tied to your current results, every defeat becomes an identity crisis. But when your identity is rooted in deeper principles, your character, your commitment to growth, your dedication to worthy objectives, defeats become information about tactics rather than verdicts about your worth. I learned to see myself as a strategist who sometimes experienced defeats rather than a defeated person trying to be strategic. This subtle but profound shift meant that setbacks informed my methods without defining my identity. My essential nature remained constant while my approaches evolved based on feedback from experience. The spiritual dimension of overcoming adversity involves recognizing that defeat often serves purposes beyond your immediate understanding. Some of my greatest defeats led to breakthroughs in thinking that would never have occurred during periods of easy success. The struggle itself became a teacher that revealed capabilities and insights unavailable through comfortable circumstances. The calm in the storm represents the inner sanctuary that remains peaceful regardless of external chaos. This inner calm is not numbness or detachment, but rather deep confidence in your ability to navigate whatever circumstances arise. It's the eye of the hurricane, where clarity and wisdom remain accessible even when everything around you is in turmoil. I developed daily practices that strengthened this inner calm, meditation that trained my mind to remain focused under pressure, philosophical study that provided perspective on temporary setbacks, and physical disciplines that built confidence. in my ability to endure discomfort. These practices created an inner fortress that external defeats could not penetrate. Mastering the inner game means understanding that the most important victory is the one you achieve over your own tendency toward despair, panic, and self-doubt when facing difficult circumstances. The greatest enemy I had to defeat was my own limiting beliefs, and this victory proved more challenging than any external battle I ever fought. The mirror shield of honest self-reflection revealed that my most formidable opponent wasn't any external force, but the internal voice that whispered convincing arguments about why success was impossible and defeat was inevitable. How self-doubt creates more defeats than external opponents became clear as I analyzed my pattern of setbacks. In many cases, my external enemies had simply exploited weaknesses that my own self-doubt had already created. When you don't believe in your capabilities, you unconsciously sabotage your efforts, make tentative decisions, and communicate uncertainty that opponents can detect and exploit. I discovered that self-doubt operates like a skilled enemy strategist within your own mind, using your intimate knowledge of your weaknesses against you. It knows exactly which fears to activate, which past failures to reference, and which insecurities to amplify to prevent you from taking the bold action necessary for victory. This internal enemy never sleeps and never stops gathering intelligence about your vulnerabilities. The art of conquering internal resistance and fear requires treating them as you would treat any strategic opponent, with respect for their power but determination to overcome their influence. I learned to study my own patterns of self-sabotage with the same analytical intensity I brought to studying enemy tactics. I mapped my internal resistance, identified its triggers, and developed countermeasures. One of my most effective strategies was to personify my self-doubt as a separate entity that I could engage in strategic dialogue. Instead of being overwhelmed by negative thoughts, I learned to recognize them as communications from this internal opponent and respond strategically rather than emotionally. This technique transformed paralyzing internal conflict into manageable strategic challenge. Why defeating yourself is the prerequisite to defeating others lies in the principle that you cannot give what you do not possess. If you haven't conquered your own fears and limitations, you cannot inspire others to conquer theirs. If you haven't developed inner confidence, you cannot project the certainty that effective leadership requires. If you haven't mastered self-discipline, you cannot maintain the consistency that complex strategies demand. Building an unconquerable inner fortress required establishing internal systems that could not be shaken by external circumstances. This meant developing unshakable principles that guided decisions regardless of pressure, building habits that maintained performance regardless of motivation, and creating identity foundations that remained stable regardless of temporary results. The mirror shield forces you to confront the truth about your own role in your defeats. It's easier to blame external circumstances, opponents' superior resources, or unfavorable conditions than to acknowledge how your own thinking and behavior contributed to unfavorable outcomes. But this honest self-reflection is essential for preventing future defeats of the same type. I learned to ask brutally honest questions about my role in every setback. How did my assumptions contribute to this outcome? What fears influenced my decisions? Where did I allow self-doubt to create hesitation that opponents exploited? Which limiting beliefs prevented me from taking actions that might have changed the result? This process was uncomfortable but essential. Each honest answer revealed internal enemies that needed to be defeated before external victories became possible. I realized that my external defeats were often simply manifestations of internal defeats that had already occurred in my thinking and belief systems. The victory over yourself is not a single battle, but an ongoing campaign that requires constant vigilance. The internal enemies of fear, doubt, and limiting beliefs are persistent and creative in finding new ways to undermine your progress. How my defeats became the foundation for helping others transformed my understanding of the ultimate purpose of adversity. What I had initially seen as personal failures became the raw material for wisdom that could guide others through their own dark periods. The defeats I had once wished to hide became the experiences I was most qualified to share. The responsibility that comes with overcoming great adversity is profound and humbling. When you emerge from significant defeats, you carry knowledge that can only be earned through suffering and struggle. This knowledge comes with an obligation to use it not just for your own benefit, but to help others who are walking the same difficult path you once traveled. I discovered that my most devastating defeats contained my most valuable teachings. The victories that came easily taught me little about resilience, adaptation, and inner strength. But the defeats that nearly broke me revealed truths about human nature, strategic thinking, and recovery that became the foundation for insights that guided leaders for generations. Why your struggles can become someone else's salvation lies in the universal nature of defeat and the personal nature of recovery. While the specific circumstances of defeat vary widely, the internal experience of being overwhelmed, questioning your abilities, and fighting to recover contains common elements that transcend individual situations. Your particular journey through these universal challenges creates wisdom that others can apply to their own unique circumstances. When I began sharing the strategies I had developed during my lowest periods, I discovered that people resonated most strongly with the insights born from my failures rather than my successes. They could relate to the experience of defeat in ways they couldn't relate to stories of easy victory. My defeats became bridges that connected my experience to their struggles. Building something meaningful from your pain and setbacks requires seeing them not as random suffering, but as raw materials for creating value that extends beyond your personal benefit. This doesn't mean that pain is inherently valuable or that defeat should be sought, but rather that once you've experienced these challenges, you have an opportunity to transform them into something that serves others. The teaching scroll represents the preservation of hard-won wisdom for future generations, just as ancient scrolls preserved knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. Your documented experience of overcoming defeat preserves insights that can guide others through similar challenges. Your defeats become data points in the collective human understanding of resilience and recovery. I began documenting not just my successful strategies, but my failed approaches, the mistakes that led to defeats, and the internal journey of recovery. This comprehensive record became more valuable than any account of smooth victories because it provided a complete map of both the obstacles and the pathways through them. The eternal nature of wisdom gained through defeat means that insights earned through struggle remain relevant across different eras and circumstances. The specific technologies, politics, and social conditions of my time have changed, but the fundamental human experience of facing defeat and choosing how to respond remains constant. This timeless relevance gives defeated turned victorious people a unique form of immortality. Your legacy is not determined by how many defeats you avoided, but by how you transformed the defeats you experienced into wisdom that outlasts your lifetime. The greatest teachers throughout history have been those who faced significant challenges and emerged with insights that could guide others through similar struggles. Your personal action plan for implementing these defeat-to-victory principles begins with understanding that recovery is not an event, but a systematic process that requires strategic thinking, patient execution, and unwavering commitment to growth through adversity. The New Dawn banner represents your fresh start, but unlike my muddy banner from that first defeat, this one is raised with the wisdom earned through understanding how to transform setbacks into comebacks. The first steps to take when you feel completely defeated start with the fundamental recognition that defeat is information, not identity. Before taking any external action, you must win the internal battle for the interpretation of your setback. Ask yourself, what is this defeat teaching me about my strategy, my preparation, or my execution? What assumptions proved false? What capabilities do I need to develop? What allies do I need to cultivate? Immediately after acknowledging the lessons, begin your victory ladder. Identify the smallest possible win you can achieve today that moves you in the direction of your ultimate objectives. This might be as simple as maintaining your daily routine, having one productive conversation, or completing a small task that demonstrates your capabilities to yourself. The key is starting momentum, not achieving perfection. How to maintain momentum during the long comeback journey requires understanding that recovery happens in cycles, not straight lines. You will have days when progress feels impossible and defeats seem to multiply. During these periods, return to your victory ladder and focus only on the next small step. Momentum is maintained through consistency of effort, not consistency of results. Build what I call your strategic support system, allies who understand your comeback objectives and can provide both tactical advice and emotional stability during difficult periods. These relationships should be established before crisis, but if you're already in defeat, begin building them immediately. Vulnerability about your struggles creates the foundation for receiving genuinely useful assistance. Building systems that prevent future defeats from devastating you involves developing multiple capabilities, so that your success doesn't depend on any single approach or strength. Diversify your skills, your relationships, your strategies, and your sources of confidence so that future setbacks cannot destroy your entire foundation simultaneously. Create your own hidden forge where you can develop capabilities away from public scrutiny and external pressure. This might be a daily learning routine, a skill-building practice, or a strategic planning process that occurs regardless of your current external circumstances. This hidden development becomes your insurance against being caught unprepared by future challenges. Practice the adaptability of flowing water by maintaining fierce commitment to your ultimate objectives while remaining completely flexible about the methods you use to achieve them. When obstacles appear, ask not how can I force my current plan to work, but how can I maintain my direction while adapting my approach to current reality. Most importantly, understand that your defeats contain the genetic code for unprecedented victories. Every setback has taught you something that success never could have revealed. Every failure has forced you to develop capabilities that comfort never would have demanded. Every moment of despair has shown you reserves of strength that easy times never would have accessed. My final words of encouragement for your strategic recovery are these: you are not defeated, you are educated. You are not broken, you are being forged. You are not finished, you are being prepared for victory that will be more complete and meaningful because it was earned through struggle rather than given through circumstance. Raise your new dawn banner with the confidence that comes from understanding defeat's true purpose as your pathway to unshakable triumph.